days are so into media of whatever types. There's a couple great things from PBS learning media. Instead of hunting around trying to find all these different things, I can search and figure out if I want to do atomic nature of matter, if I want to do water cycle or the magnetosphere. I can find those resources, show a short clip to students, get them engaged and excited, have a discussion of like, well, what does this really look like? I feel like accessing those resources helps me engage students, and I feel like PBS does a great job at that. And when they say, like, you helped my son graduate high school, you helped my daughter pass this class, that encourages me and helps me feel like, okay, I am making a difference.
Idle hands. They say they're the devil's workshop. But give idle hands a place to go, a purpose, and they're capable of amazing things.
Hi everyone, I'm Kristen Bell, and I invited you here to my hotel room to talk about your cheeks, your big, beautiful cheeks. Get your mind out of the gutter. I'm talking about swabbing them. Did you guys know that each year 20,000 Americans with blood cancer are searching for their life-saving marrow match? So here's how we can help. It's really, really simple. All you have to do is swab your cheek, this cheek. Then go to giftoflife.org and request a free kit so that you can swab a cheek and save a life.
This is East Tennessee PBS.
And 5 times 5 is?
25.
Yeah. Hey folks, welcome, and welcome out there. We have Mathline. Yes, we have Mathline. It's Specialized Segments Day. I'm Ernie Roberts. I'm your host for today's session. We are glad that you've tuned in today, and we hope that you are ready to get some incredible news of math. Well, hopefully some practice, all right? As we explore a nice topic of some sort, and we explore it in depth, we work some problems together. Now, today's going to be a little bit different. I don't even think you'll need to touch a calculator. How's that sound? But get you some pencil, get you some paper. We're going to write down a few things along the way, and let's have a good time with the show. And what are we doing today, guys? What's it all about? Mean what you say and say what you mean. Ooh, I've heard that somewhere. Mean what you say and say what you mean. That's somewhere from Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland or something. But you know what? There's a big important thing to say about this. So let's see what this is all about today. All about conditional sentences. And what is a conditional sentence to begin with? Well, we look at if-then type statements, all right? So if something happens, then something else should follow right in place, okay? Or if something happens, then this will happen. Now, sometimes you can switch those things around, and that's when we start saying, what do you really mean? What are you trying to say? So let's take a look at our first conditional sentence, which has been flashing up there for me to say, yes, let's take a look at Ben, my friend who lives in Atlanta. And here's a very straightforward sentence, and it is a conditional sentence. Why? Because you have if and you have then. So we've got Ben living in Atlanta, then Ben lives in the state of Georgia. True or false? Well, of course, that would be true if you're talking about Atlanta, Georgia. I don't know many other Atlantas, to be honest with you, so we're going to go with that, all right? We're going to go there and say he is living in Atlanta, so therefore he lives in the state of Georgia. We call things that go along with this, we're in about the hypothesis and the conclusion. I'm going to use a little H for the hypotenuse, and I'm going to use a C for the conclusion. Now, how do we discover what the hypothesis is in this sentence? It's the thought, it's the part that's attached, not including, but attached to the little word if. This is the big one, all right? We're going to say our hypothesis is that Ben lives in Atlanta. The conclusion is what's attached to the then. So the conclusion here is that he basically lives, we'll see if I can get that S right, in Georgia. State of Georgia, whatever, all right. So this is the storyline, what we got going here. So what comes first? With if is a hypothesis. The conclusion comes with then comes attached to it. So it's a two-part sentence. And we got a little comma separating it so you know it's coming. And sometimes you may just say, if Ben lives in Atlanta, he lives in the state of Georgia, where then is kind of understood. But we're going to make it if-then specifically. Because in our world of geometry that we have in mathematics, we really put that little THEN in there quite often into our theorems, our definitions, postulates. Oh my goodness, those of you who are taking geometry say, I remember those kind of sentences. And in fact, my friends, you have been using if-then sentences all your life. Remember when you try to tell your parents, if you love me, you'll let me stay up after 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, watch TV, do this, do that, and the other. Oh, it's after a late time for bedtime tonight, kind of thing. That was an if-then. You were using it, like I said, when you're 2 or 3 years old, ready to just kind of manipulate your parents as best you could. How about that? We're going to manipulate you in geometry today. So let's keep this one in mind, and let's see what we're going to do with Ben and his Atlanta gig here, all right? See what's happening there. And we've got a new one coming up. We're going to keep the same sentence now, all right? And what we want to do now is go with a thing called the converse, the inverse, and contrapositive. You say, wait a minute, Ernie, what are those things? We do know the conditional sentence, if Ben lives in Atlanta, then he lives in the state of Georgia. Got that down, all right? We're good on that part. So what we're going to do with the converse, let's talk about that first. Converse, some of you are going, aren't those shoes? Well, in geometry, they're not your shoes. But what happens in a converse is just that. We take the hypothesis and the conclusion, which we remember is Ben lives in Atlanta, is the hypothesis. He lives in the state of Georgia is conclusion. We're going to switch them. You say, really? Really? So what we're going to say now, we're going to keep if and then. That's why I say if and then are not part of the hypothesis or part of the conclusion. They are the signalers. They basically signal this thing happening, all right? So here goes. The converse, which once again, by definition, basically we interchange hypothesis and conclusion and try not to dismantle the thought of it, all right? So the converse in this thing would be starting off with good old if. This time we're going to say if Ben lives in Georgia. Got it? Guess where it's going to go? You got it, right? You're writing this at home, I hope. Then he lives in Atlanta. And am I going to have enough room to write in Atlanta? I am. Yay. I did that just right. So there you see. Look what happened. Now Ben lives in Georgia is our new hypothesis. He lives in Atlanta is now the conclusion. Well, let's say something about this. I know a few more places than Atlanta that are located in Georgia. So Ben may live in Georgia, but does that mean he necessarily will live in Atlanta? All of a sudden, we have changed the whole nature of this sentence. No longer do we have a true statement. Actually, we have a false statement. Because this guy could live in Macon. He could live in Augusta. He could live up north in Dalton. He could live all over the place. He could live out in some rural farmland down in southeast Georgia, even Savannah. So you get the idea. So why did I say it's a false statement? Because it doesn't work for all possibilities. Could he live in Atlanta? Sure, and that would make it true. But the problem is he could live anywhere, and that makes it a false statement because we really don't know the answer to that, okay? Because we're just saying, hey, that guy Ben, he lives in Georgia, all right? Does that mean he necessarily lives in Atlanta? Absolutely not. So we got to be careful. When we make a converse happen, will it always be true? Well, the front end is true, right? The conditional sentence we started with was true. If Ben lives in Atlanta and he lives in Georgia, we'll say that one's true. But notice what happened when we changed the basically hypothesis and conclusion interchanging, things happen. Now, that's the converse, straightforward. Let's talk about this little guy called the inverse. The inverse, what does it do? Well, it sounds like we want some opposites to happen. And in this case, both of my original, go back to the original conditional sentence. Ben living in Atlanta, living in the state of Georgia, they're positive statements. By positive statements, I mean they're not saying not, he doesn't, he, that kind of thing. He's saying he lives, he does live there, all right? So that's a positive influence there. So what we're going to do with the inverse is we're going to change that original, go back to the original hypothesis, and make it the opposite. In this case, it's going to have a not involved in it. If Ben doesn't live in Atlanta, or Ben doesn't live in Atlanta. Did I just say that? I did say that, didn't I? Then he doesn't live in the state of Georgia. So let's check that one out. That's the inverse. In other words, we're going to be the opposite. Now, does it always have to have a not in it? If you started positive, it's going to have to get a not to be negative. And by the way, you negate or you do the opposite of both hypothesis and the conclusion. Don't leave one out, because then you don't have anything that makes sense, okay? Some of you are probably saying, well, this is not making sense that much either. But let's go with it here. So this time, if Ben does not, and I'm going to put a big not there, all right, live in Atlanta, then what? He doesn't live in Georgia. And I'm just going to put Georgia there, all right, GA. Now, let's think about that a minute. He does not live in Atlanta, then he doesn't live in Georgia. Well, if he doesn't live in Atlanta, maybe he lives in Macon. That would put him in Georgia, wouldn't it? So again, we've come up with some ways. In fact, it almost sounds these go together pretty well, don't they? We have a false situation once again, because we are, again, you can't make it verify every time. There are so many what we call counterexamples that we can put up there and say, well, what if this happens? And if this happens and it holds true, but it goes against what we have here, then that makes the statement false. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? In other words, all I have to do is come up with one counterexample that goes against this crazy statement. And I just said, let's let the guy live in Macon. He's down in Macon, Georgia. But that just blew this because he doesn't live in Atlanta. But nope, he does live in Georgia. So again, got to be careful with them. Now, I've got one more word waiting for us up here. And I know y'all can't wait to hear what this one's about, because we've twisted these sentences crazy, haven't we? We have now put nots and we put a doesn't there. It's like does not live in Georgia, all right? So let's go back to what we call this last little guy, the contrapositive. That in itself, just spelling it's good. You know, it's contra and then the word positive. It's against the positive, against what we started with. Well, maybe not so much so here. Because what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the contrapositive is when I want to do, and I want to write this down just because these are cool little expressions. It's the inverse of the converse. You say, what, Ernie? Inverse of the converse. But you know what we could also say? Because they so relate so well, it's going to be the same thing as if I took the converse of the inverse. Inverse of the converse or converse of the inverse. So, whoa. So we're going to work with Ben living in Georgia. Let's go there. And we want the inverse of the converse, all right? We're going to start right here. So we're going to say, in this one, I'm going to put a little circle around it so we don't get it all confused, because there's a lot of writing on this page, isn't there? Basically, it says, if what? Ben doesn't live in Georgia? We'll put that not in there. Live in Georgia. Then he does not, again, put that in there. Oh, I can make it capitals just for you guys. Not live in Atlanta. And I'm going to put a little abbreviation there. Okay, let's think about this one. How valid is that statement? If Ben does not live in Georgia, so that means he's not in the state of Georgia. Oh my goodness, then he doesn't live in Atlanta, does he? We are back to true. Now, some of you are going to say, my goodness, Ernie, you twisted and mangled that sentence all over the place. That's the different levels we can do with logic here, all right? We can pick these up. Lots of ways we can take two thoughts and work with them. And of course, some of you are probably starting to think, well, could you put a positive and a negative? No, don't want to go there. You got to do it. If you do it with the hypothesis, you got to do it with the conclusion. You've got to involve both, all right? You can't just switch one and let it go. That's not the game plan here, all right? But I want you to notice something here. Ooh. We started out with a true statement. We ended up with a true statement. We went through a couple of falsehoods in between, but there you go. Now you say, well, Ernie, are the converses and the inverse always going to be false? Well, in this case, they were. I will tell you this. Usually, when the converse is false, the inverse is going to fall right in place because they're so closely related. But I want you to notice also something here. If we start with a true statement with our beginning conditional sentence, then guess what? We're going to end up with a true statement of a contrapositive. That's what we call logically equivalent, And that's a pretty amazing little fact. But you try it with a few other ideas out there. We're not going to have time to do too many of them here to show today. But think about that, how it works. So let's go to a fact we all are quite well aware of in the world of geometry. In fact, even if we were in 4th and 5th grade, we probably have learned this, maybe even 3rd grade. So let's take a look at a declarative sentence here. Basically, it's saying, hey, a right angle has a measure of 90 degrees. I might as well just say that sounds like a definition, because that's how we define a right angle. It has 90 degrees measurement, all right? So what we want to do is write that in a conditional form. So let's do it, an if-then form. So we're going to take this statement. What comes first, my friends? Right angle, right? Oh boy, that's a lot of rights in there, isn't it? Has a measure of 90 degrees. 90 degrees is what's going to follow. So here's our story. If an angle is a right angle, then, it's time for the then. Then what have we got? It measures, we'll just say the angle measures, because it sounds so kind of like, what are we talking about? We'll say the angle measures 90 degrees, okay? And I'll use the degree form. We know what we've got going there. So here's the if. Hypothesis, this time we have a right angle. Angle we got is a right angle. Conclusion, that angle measures 90 degrees. Why? Because what they told us was a right angle, didn't they? Now, that's our conditional form. So remember, this is the hypothesis. We'll put a little h there. This out here is our conclusion. And you know what we're going to do? We're going to see how well this stands up to converse, inverse, and contrapositive. Now, I'm going to invite you to go ahead and start writing those if you're tuned in with us here at home and somewhere. Go ahead and see if you can come up with those, or you can do them in your head. This may not be one of those things you have to write down, but we're going to move on to the next sheet here, and we'll see if we can't work with that. Again, I have got you your conditional sentence ready to go here, and let's take a look at what we've got down here. It says we're going to write the converse, the inverse. We're going to do one at a time. That's always the best way to do that. Don't multitask too hard on these things, because you know what? They get kind of banged up, kind of crazy. So we got to make sure we're doing it right, okay? So if an angle is a right angle, then its measure is 90 degrees. All right. Now, we could do a nice little shortcut motion here, all right? Here's our H, here is our C, right? And what I see here is a right angle with the letter R. That's the concept. It's a right angle is what our hypothesis is all about. So we're going to give it a different letter here in just a second. And the measure is 90 degrees. We'll put N for 90, all right? So basically what we've got here is the conditional sentence saying, if R, then N. That's so nice to compact it. And I find my students appreciate these a little bit better when they can see it just in this way, and then they can plug the idea back in once they've got everything set up. So that's your conditional sentence. We'll call it a CS for short, all right? Now, converse, remember, converse. Basically, we're going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So we're going to say if 90, then we have a right angle. Okay, so we have an angle at 90 degrees, it measures 90 degrees, we have a right angle. That's also true. So this is true. We'll put a big T there. This is true. Converse is. And so we go like, does that mean the inverse is going to be? Well, we're going to find out. How about it? Let's go back to the conditional. This will be our inverse, by the way. This will be the inverse. This was the converse. And let's put a little squiggle in front of that. So in other words, this means if not R, or the opposite of R, if you will. In other words, it's not a right angle. Then that angle, we'll put another not with it, isn't going to be 90 degrees. We know what? That's very true. If we don't have a right angle, my friends, we do not have a 90-degree angle. So there's an inverse that's true. And how about it? Our contrapositive. What about that? Let's see if I can spell it still. I got it. Contrapositive. There it is. Just think of it. Contrapositive. And in this case, we're going to say if not N, then not R. And that's a whole different thought, isn't it? But is it true? If it's not a 90-degree angle, then what? It's not going to be a right angle. So once again, we're at true here. So we say The hypothesis and conclusion are, in a situation like this where all four pieces are true, they are reversible. In other words, it didn't matter which one came first, did it? And I want to tell you something about it. If you use a true definition, in geometry, you will be able to do all these conditionals and they will all come out to be true. They are reversible. They are reversible. You don't just have to worry about the conditional sentence and its contrapositive. They'll always match. But these two guys in the middle will also work with any kind of definition. Now, that's where we got to understand what's the difference between a definition, a theorem, and a postulate. All right? So this was a definition simply saying, hey, right angles have measures of 90 degrees. Oh, angles that have measures of 90 degrees are right angles. It works both ways. See how I say it? It's reversible. Which came first? Remember, we had a declarative statement earlier. We can take it right back to the declarative statement here. 90-degree angles have 90-degree angles are right angles. About to say they have 90 degrees. Of course they do. Of course they do. So let's take a look at what I mentioned here. Let's look at a little theorem. It's true. What we got here is very true. But what we're going to do, we're going to check out the converse, the inverse, and our friend the contrapositive. All right? Of the conditional sentence, if two angles are right angles, then they are congruent. So what's going on here? This is really a nice if-then thing of the little theorem that you guys learned first week in geometry, second week maybe in geometry. All right angles are congruent. In other words, if you got two angles that are right angles, if you have any number of right angles, they're going to be congruent to each other. Now, what does congruent mean? They have to have the same measurement. Well, some of you are already going like, of course they have that same measurement, Ernie. Right angles have 90 degrees by definition. Exactly. Then that would make them congruent. So let's play our game here. Let's use the if-then form. Let's use if R for right angles. Then C for congruent. All right? So our concept is we're going to have R for right angles, C for congruent, and we'll come back in if you need to, right at home or whatever. You can fill in the little information here. You can switch things around. I'll read them to you for right now because it does take a long time for me to write them down on the air, doesn't it? And you're like, yes, it does. All right. So there is our conditional sentence, and it is a true conditional sentence. All right? Conditional sentence. If you have right angles, two right angles, they will be congruent. That's what we're saying there. Now, what happens if I have the converse? Remember, C swaps out with R. If they're congruent, then they're right angles. Well, sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's true. But there are a lot of other ways it doesn't have to be true. What if both of them are congruent? They have 30-degree measurements. They're not right angles, are they? They're acute. Okay, well, what if they have 150 degrees each? They're not right angles. They're obtuse. Remember what I said? One counterexample is all you need. You can find many counterexamples for this one. So because we have some things that do not allow this to be true all of the time, it's a false statement. We're going to go with it in that regard. So there you have it. There's the first thing, all right? So the conditional sentence was great, which, by the way, like I said, was a theorem. So let's work the other side of things here. I think I've got enough room here. Let's go to the inverse of right and congruent here, all right? So if not a right angle, then not congruent. Well, you know, I could pick up two angles that aren't the same measure. I could have a 30 and a 40. And they're not congruent. So it's true. But what about if they were 30 and 30? In other words, those both angles are not right angles. But guess what? 30 and 30 degrees match up congruently. So again, I've come up with a counterexample, and there are many of them you could come up with. So let's go with a big old false on this one, because it doesn't work for every case. It doesn't work for everything. Now here comes our big moment. Will the contrapositive hold? Now those of you who've stuck with me through the whole show at this point say, yes, it will. Let's find out. So if they're not congruent angles, in other words, they've got to have two different measurements, then what do you know? They cannot be right angles. Well, of course not. Because if they're both right angles, they've got to be 90s, and if they're not, see what I'm saying? Here's the logic of it. So go back. They're not congruent, so pick an angle. Pick any two angles that are not the same. Well, you're certainly not going to get two 90s out of it, are you? Never are you going to get two 90s out of it. So that is really pretty cool. That's a pretty good idea there. So that's the story here. By the way, it is true. And again, I'll use this expression I used a few minutes ago. A conditional statement, or conditional sentence, as we like to call them, and it's contrapositive. So here we go, here, and here we go here. These two are what we call logically equivalent. In other words, if I start off with the true, I'm going to end up with the true. Now, does that mean if I start out with a false statement here, will I end up with a false statement here? Absolutely. It does, all right? So take it from the logic standpoint of these things. And I'll tell you something. Attorneys love to say, well, can kind of put some doubt in the juror's mind or into the witness's mind or twist it a little bit. But you've got to listen. Again, remember what we say. Say what you mean what you say. What comes first can make a difference, especially in a problem like this. It doesn't always work in reverse, what you've been saying with your if and then. Now, I would like to do one more thing, guys. Hang on just with me. Let me go back and find Ben in Atlanta here one more time. Hope we still got him. That will put him right here. I want to show you what goes on here, really. We're going to make the state of Georgia into a circle, all right? Did it work? It got there. In here we've got Atlanta, all right? So there's the Atlanta. This is the state of Georgia. I know the state of Georgia is not a circle. Everybody else knows that too. It's not a square either. It's kind of funny looking. It's got some geographical things that make things happen for us there, but we love it. But if Ben lives in Atlanta, see what? He's inside of Georgia, all right? If Ben lives in Georgia, he's right in there. He doesn't have to be inside Atlanta. There was that converse moment, all right? But if he's not in Georgia, that means he's somewhere out here. This is where we'll put him. He's definitely not in Atlanta either. So again, that's another little way you can make a little diagram. We call those Venn diagrams. You can make that, and Ben's his own little world out here. How about that? But that's Ben outside the circle. You got the idea. So again, I want you to see that these are like little Venn diagrams. We call them subsets of each other. Atlanta's a subset of Georgia, and Ben could be a subset of Atlanta if he's in Atlanta. But he's out here? No way. So there you have it, folks. Mean what you say what you mean, and you know what? You can say it the other way. Say what you mean and mean what you say. It means the same thing, right? It's telling you, be careful of what you choose. And your if-then statements, conditional statements are fun. They really are. But you got to remember, if you switch the hypothesis conclusion, unless you're using like a definition or a really pure situation where it's going to be reversible, you might come up with some interesting conclusions and some false ones at that too, all right? So thanks for tuning in this afternoon. Enjoy your conditional sentences. We'll play with them some more in another show. And you know what? We'll look forward to seeing you guys again to see us next time.
Join me along with Walter Isaacson, Michelle Martin, Hari Srinivasan, and Alicia Menendez for Amanpour & Company on PBS.
In a time of change, where can you find in-depth reporting and thoughtful analysis? Washington Week on PBS. Join moderator Robert Costa
When I was at the Capitol this week, I encountered the same...
and a panel of award-winning journalists
You're seeing a divided nation, and you're seeing...
for insights and perspective
Tonight there was a key development in the
you
Senate.
won't find anywhere else.
What a week.
Washington Week.
Next time on Antiques Roadshow.
So what you've got essentially is many of the 1950s Hall of Famers.
When these arrived in the mail, I called my dad because my dad was a huge baseball fan. And he said, "Stop what you're doing. Is there any Mickey Mantle card in there?" That was the first thing I looked for.
That's the first thing I looked for.
Is there a Mickey in the bunch? Find out more next time on Antiques Roadshow from Cottazon in Sarasota, Florida.
Monday at 8.
Hi, I'm Mary Constantine, the food writer for the Knoxville News Sentinel. I'm here in Sequoia Hills at the PLAID Apron, a Knoxville restaurant I support that has a passion for our community through food. I love their personal relationships with local vendors, farmers, and customers, and the creativity that Chef Drew McDonald displays as he takes a local farmer's raw product and transforms it into edible art. I also love East Tennessee PBS, a station that offers its viewers shows like A Chef's Life, which chronicles the hard work of farmers dedicated to their product, and The Mind of a Chef, a show that delves into the creative psyche of culinary masters. As local restaurants support the farm-to-table movement, so too does East Tennessee PBS by bringing exciting food programming to our local community. Please consider supporting East Tennessee PBS by contributing at www.easttennesseepbs.org/give.
This is East Tennessee PBS.